A great director can also carry these ideas across a variety of scenes, creating a unified sequence that continues the blocking choices from one scene into the next. And these moves don't need to be complex. In fact, sometimes the most basic blocking, if done thoughtfully, can be the most dramatic. Let's now explore how director Gus Van Sant uses the same techniques across two different scenes in Good Will Hunting to also play on this idea of character dominance. The first scene is a scene between two characters meeting for the first time. One character's name is Will Hunting, the title character of the film, played by Matt Damon. Will is a blue-collar kid with a genius IQ and a criminal record that has forced him into seeing a psychologist. The psychologist is the other character. His name is Sean, and he's played by Robin Williams in the film. So, I want you to think of this blocking as kind of a boxing match of sorts. In the previous scenes, we've watched Will mentally intimidate a number of other therapists. Each one quits by the end of a single session. And we learn that Will has a tendency to find each of their weaknesses and then to really drill in and exploit it. We know that he's going to try the same thing with Sean, but we don't know much about Sean, so we're curious to see how this mental tug of war plays out. But before we dive into this scene, let's think back to our standard scene choices. Two people in one room. This is a good example of that. If we wanted a standard scene, we'd have Will facing east and Sean facing west. And that's how Van Sant starts the scene. Now, I'm not going to detail every shot because it's the broad pattern that really matters. It's the rhythm of Van Sant's scene that really kind of creates the music, if you know what I mean. So he starts like this, very conventional. Two guys sitting in chairs, facing each other, talking. In these four shots, Sean seems to have the upper hand. Both men have the same shape, two physically fit guys. Will's a little younger, but Sean is sitting higher in the frame. And when you look at the eye lines, you can see that Sean is looking down on Will, and Will is looking up at Sean. Nevertheless, they're both of roughly equal scale. So Sean may have the home field advantage for this fight, but the fight starts off pretty even. But now watch how Van Sant takes this conventional beginning and modifies it into a metaphorical boxing match. Will attacks first. He stands up. He's on the prowl. And he walks straight towards the camera. This is one shot, and it moves from a medium shot to a close-up. Will dominates the frame, the biggest close-up of the scene. This gives him the most power. And it also changes the dynamic. These two men are no longer facing each other. Will is facing the camera. And now we can really see his eyes as he looks around, trying to find the weakness that he can exploit. And this, in the next two shots, this is where Will is dominant. Round one goes to Will. But then Sean starts talking about weightlifting, something that the young Will really feels confident about. So Will sits back down. But now look at these two shots. You can tell without even hearing the dialogue who can lift more weight. Sean is dominant. Will is at a disadvantage. Ding ding, round two goes to Sean. But then Will comes out fighting in round three. He stands up again and finds a picture that Sean painted. And then Van Sant frames Will in the same dominant frame as before, a close-up looking directly into the lens. But this time, he places Sean in the background, small and out of focus, diminished. And this is when Will attacks, personally, intellectually, critiquing Sean through his painting. They don't face each other. Instead, Sean stands up, gets closer, bigger, but still not as big as Will, still out of focus, still weakened. And at this point, I want to put a pin in this scene for a second. And I want to talk about lenses and something called depth of field. Now, I used to work as a cinematographer in Manhattan for a few years when I was going to graduate school. And I worked with lenses, and lenses always intrigued me. Now, I won't go into the physics of light and lens, but it's enough to know that different lenses keep different amounts of the scene in focus. It's what's called the depth of field, and it's basically a measurement of how deep your focus is. The depth of field. How deep is your field of focus? Lenses can adjust that depth of field by adjusting the lens and aperture opening, or iris. This then changes the degree of what is in focus and what is out of focus, or soft. So, back to Will and Sean. They're both facing the same direction. An interesting choice because people don't typically speak to each other that way. And even more interesting because they're facing the camera itself, which means that we can see both characters' faces, but they can't see each other's. And Van Sant guides our attention to this by using focus, his depth of field. At first, Will is in focus and Sean is out of focus, and this is when Will attacks. But when Sean parries, Van Sant adjusts the zoom lens and puts Sean in focus instead. And then he changes it again when Will takes back the control of the scene. Occasionally, they turn to face each other, but for the most part, the conversation pivots not on the actor's movement, but on the movement of the lens. But then it seems as if Will gets the upper hand. He finds Sean's weakness and starts to exploit it. And the blocking in the scene reflects this. Will gets even closer to the camera, even larger in the frame, and Sean grows smaller, more out of focus, weaker. And when Will turns to face him, we find that Sean has turned away. Again, they're not facing each other. Sean has taken off his glasses, he may even be crying. It seems like Will has won round 3, maybe even the knockout, and then wham! Sean whips around in 2 quick cuts, and they're face to face again, with Sean's hand wrapped around Will's neck. A facing east, B facing west. Isolated close-ups to show Sean's anger and Will's fear. A surprise round 3 knockout goes to Sean, as Will exits frame and Sean is left alone. Gus Van Sant uses framing and focus, blocking and eye lines to both design a literal and figurative fight scene. It works verbally, it works viscerally, consciously, and subconsciously. But most impressively, he carries the ideas through this scene and into the next scene where these characters meet yet again. Bear with me, it's only a few shots, but I think this is worth exploring. A few scenes later, Sean and Will meet again. This time they're in a park. Neutral ground. They sit on a bench. Neutral height. They don't even face each other. They sit side by side, both characters facing north. And this is really important because Will is a confrontational character. He meets aggression with aggression. Sean knows that he needs to win him over, and he also knows that confrontation will only drive the young man away. We know that confrontation will also drive Will away. So Van Sant devises a scene where Sean addresses Will as an equal. It's not a confrontation, it's a conversation. Doesn't really matter what they say, but just look at these 4 shots. These 4 shots carry the scene, but in these shots, the characters are equal, non-confrontational, pensive, serious. But it's not an attack. And in the end, Sean walks away, leaving Will to contemplate his next move. Not as a battle, but as an invitation. And that's what draws these 2 deeper into the story together. One scene doesn't work without the other. These 2 scenes and future scenes play off of this dynamic of trust and conflict. And in some ways, it's the entire theme of the movie encapsulated in these scenes. It's the key to Will's transition as a character. Van Sant completely understands this, and he knows how to capture and communicate it through blocking and the way that he frames his shots, or rather, how his cinematographer framed the shots. And really, it's the movement, editing, and framing that collectively create a rhythm between these scenes, and that tie them together. One scene subsequently working with the next scene in the series to create a rhythm within each sequence. Great directors, cinematographers, and editors recognize that blocking a scene on its own is only one part of a greater whole.